Hello, everyone. I'm so pleased to see everyone here tonight for this virtual book launch of Stefano's new 2-volume book. So I'm really honored to be hosting and moderating this book launch. And as I said, this is for Stefano's 2-volume collection, Anthology of Contemporary Classics in Analytical Psychology, The New Ancestors, with 1 volume focusing on clinical contributions and the other on theoretical contributions. What Stefano has accomplished is no small feat. And for me, at least, there is an important trend in his publications to investigate and appreciate where we've been in order to know where we're going as a field of endeavor. In other words, there is a real concern for the field's history, however fractious or unified it may have been at any given point in time. The first book in his growing publication list was Breakfast at Kuznacht, which struck me as a definitive oral history of the development of analytical psychology specifically and depth psychology more generally. These 2 volumes, in my mind, continue that important work. These compilations capture and chart an era of unbound potential, clinicians, theorists, academics coming together to try to define a field of endeavor. The energy, passion, and expertise jump off every page. It also gives readers a flavor of the diversity of approaches and topics explored in analytical psychology. It strikes me that Stefano had a real intersectional ethos in mind when approaching and curating this important collection. It's a magnificent contribution, a reference point for Jungians, post-Jungians, neo-Jungians, the young Jungians, or whatever classification you want to assign to groups sharing a common theoretical base. Stefano is a real force to be reckoned with in our field, bringing a new direction and the necessary vital energy to keep the momentum going. Now, on that note, I want to point all our colleagues here to 2 additional volumes that Stefano has had a really important hand in. So the first one, and for me, a very timely, very crucial book, is a co-edited volume entitled Lockdown Therapy, Jungian Perspectives on How the Pandemic Changed Psychoanalysis, co-edited with the magnificent and wonderful Dr. Monica Lucci. And that's coming out in August. Now, the second book that Stefano has edited is called Individuation and Liberty in a Globalized World, Psychosocial Perspectives on Freedom After Freedom. Now, this book is coming out on June the 6th with a 2-day conference based on the book's themes happening on June 3rd and June 4th. So for all our colleagues, please look out for these 2 volumes as well. Now, I'm also pleased and very privileged to welcome and introduce 4 of our most revered ancestors. And now I just want to give a brief personal account of my engagement with the work of our senior colleagues, but also just perhaps some brief personal reflections and also vignettes. And I must stress these are personal vignettes. Our colleagues may not be prepared for what I have to say and what I've observed at a distance, but hopefully everyone won't be too surprised. So first and foremost, Mary Watkins. Hello, Mary. It's so nice to meet you for the first time virtually today. Your research on psychologies of liberation, particularly your deep respect of knowledge from the global South, continues to be a model and guiding light on how our discipline enters into mutual dialogue with other knowledges, rather than adopting a conquistador approach that only repeats a colonial mindset. In particular, your chapter, Depth Psychology and Liberation of Being, was central to my own thinking on decolonizing initiatives in Jungian and post-Jungian studies. So thank you so much, Mary. Very nice to meet you tonight. Next, Verena Kast. What more do we need to say about Professor Verena Kast? Former professor of psychology at the University of Zurich, president of the C.G. Jung Institute, Zurich, author of numerous books, including Sisyphus, A Jungian Approach to Midlife Crisis, and in particular this one that I really enjoyed, Joy, Inspiration, and Hope, things I'm sure we can agree we're all in need of in these trying times. Now, I recall being told before giving a talk at the C.G. Jung Institute that Verena sometimes sat in on lectures being delivered by external speakers. I felt myself tense up as I started to scan the room, trying to see whether Verena was in the audience. Now, what I want to emphasize was my initial gut reaction, which I know says something about me and my own anxiety, but also, I hope, it says something about the esteem with which Verena is held, the deep respect that we all have for her research, her clinical work, and her leadership. So hello, Verena. Thank you for joining us tonight. Next, we have John Beebe. What can I say about John? Now, obviously, this is a classic, Integrity in Depth, and we also know that John is the foremost expert in psychological types. So there you go, John. Now, I dare say that any self-respecting Jungian and psychoanalytic thinker will have these monographs on their bookshelves. But I want to share a more personal vignette. It was 2009, and I had just been appointed to my post at the University of Essex. I recall Andrew introducing me to John at a conference, and Andrew saying something about my research interests. Without hesitation, John sat me down and started providing me with a copious number of references, which he wrote down on a tiny piece of paper. And I still have that piece of paper in a drawer upstairs. So, John, your warmth and good cheer towards an unknown entering your domain and field of study will never be forgotten and will be cherished always. So, John, thank you and welcome tonight. Last, definitely not least, Andrew Samuels, Professor Andrew Samuels, for me at least, the architect of Jungian and post-Jungian studies, someone I am lucky to call a colleague, mentor, and friend. Andrew's books and articles have been published and translated into numerous languages, and I don't think I need to list them here. Indeed, I won't have the time to do so, but I just picked off the 3 that I had in my bookshelf, the last 3 in the shelf dedicated to Andrew's work. So we have here Politics on the Couch, the edited volume that he had with Del Lowenthal, and of course, A New Therapy for Politics. Now, I admire Andrew's activism, his conviction and his beliefs, and his willingness to make a stand. Above all else, Andrew is an ancestor because of what he invests in the future, whether it's generating fresh ideas, backing new ideas, starting new organizations, pointing to new areas of endeavor, or mentoring and nurturing people like me and Steph. So thank you, Andrew, and very great, very wonderful to see you here tonight. I'm hoping that Mary, John, Verena, and Andrew, along with Stefano, will say something about their contributions, the time perhaps they were writing in, what they think they accomplished with their respective pieces, and what, if anything, they might change now. But before we delve further into these specific contributions, I would like to invite Stefano, the man of the hour, to say a few words about the anthology, his thinking behind it, and his intention in bringing this massive project to life. Now, before actually I hand over to Stefano, one last thing, I promise, and then I will be quiet. Routledge have generously provided a discount code for the volumes if purchased directly on the Routledge website. So while I hand over to Stefano, I will put the discount code into the chat box. So without further ado, I will hand over to Stefano Carpani.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much for your kind words. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Verena. Thank you, John. Thank you, Andrew. But also, thank you to Lionel Corbett, Astrid Berg, Warren Coleman, and Denise Ramos, who are also in the audience. Let me start with the cover. And this is the second cover. I would like to go through the names. It's very important because there are 29 contributors. Paul Bishop, Anne Casement, James Hollis, Verena, of course, Stanton Marlan, Renos Papadopoulos, Denise Ramos, Susan Rowland, Sonu Shamdasani, Heyong Shen, Thomas Singer, Mary Stein, Mary Watkins, Luigi Zoya. On the clinical book, We have John, Beebe, Astrid Berg, Patricia Berry, Fanny Brewster, Joseph Cambray, Joe Cambray, Joan Chodorov, Warren Coleman, Lionel Corbett, George Jorgensen, Donald Kalshit, Eva Pattis Zoya, Andrew Samuels, P.S. Kogeman, Ursula Wirtz, and Paul Lee Jung Eisendrath. 29 amazing names. I worked on these projects for 3 years. It was not easy, but we made it. So I would like to express my gratitude to them, to the contributors, to Routledge, who supported my idea to create such a book. Who exactly are today's Jungian ancestors? Asked Andrew Samuels when endorsing my first book, titled Breakfast at Kuznach. Not really Jung, von Franz, Tony Wolff, Neumann, Jacobi, Hillman, or Fordham, he answered, and continued, well, of course we all read them, but ancestors change. The analysts who studied under those giants are, if not today's giants, at least already ancestors in their own right. This is the basis from which I developed the idea of this book and ask myself, who are the new ancestors for my generation of newly certified analysts? Of course, ancestor is a controversial term, and maybe we have to distinguish between mentors and ancestors. I propose that mentors are personal, and that the mentor and the mentored mutually attract each other and benefit from the relationship. Without this precondition, there is no mentor-mentor relation. Take, for example, Plato and Socrates, Jung and Freud, which was certainly a mentoring relationship while it lasted and became for Jung an ancestral relationship only after Freud's death. Therefore, ancestors, I propose, are collective and belong to the whole community, the family. You cannot choose an ancestor, it is there. But when talking about ancestor, we have to be careful, because if we follow the Cambridge Dictionary, we find that an ancestor is a person related to you who lived a long time ago. I prefer the version from the Collins Dictionary. Your ancestors are the people from whom you are descended. And there is no doubt that although our daily lives are so different from those of our ancestors, we could trace our ancestor back a few hundred years. This is exactly what I'm trying to do with this book. Synonymous to these are the concept of forefather, foremother, predecessor, precursor, and forerunner. Someone who has been there before you and had an influence on you and who you have become. I propose that the above-mentioned ancestor by Samuels are the ancestor of the previous generation, his generation, your generation, the post-Jungians. Therefore, the question is, who are the ancestor of my generation, the neo-Jungians, and the next generations? Who are the new ancestor? This book tries to answer those questions, and hopefully this book will also serve as a guidebook for those adventuring this field looking for the new ancestors, as well as to serve future generation of Jungian analysts, scholars, historians, and students. The importance of this manuscript to the Jungian community lies in the overall impact of the work of the individual contributing to it. Amazing individuals. The book also plays a role in expanding current discussion on Jung, maybe rejuvenating current discussion on Jung, the post-Jungians and the contemporary analytical psychology studies, and some of the important issues addressed by it. Furthermore, the book constitutes recognition of the generation of the post-Jungians that shaped analytical psychology after Jung. Another important aspect that helped me to advance and shape the idea of an anthology of contemporary classics in analytical psychology is the fact that despite many differences, as Verena, you underlined in the preface of my book Breakfast at Kuznach, we should reflect deeper on the figure and symbolism of the Jungian analyst, and that if and when doing so, we can feel and discern a common basic attitude. I believe there is a truth in what Verena stated 2 years ago. Therefore, there is a common basic attitude as well as an heterogeneous one. Important is also to underline that Jung should not be taken as a messiah who already said everything there is to say, and that the Jungians are a cult. These would harm our field. How were the ancestors included in this anthology? I ran an informal, although international survey with candidates and colleagues in 2019. I asked them, who exactly are today's Jungian ancestors? I asked colleagues to name their own new ancestor among those analysts and scholars alive, active in analytical psychology from the 1980s onward. This was to avoid confusion with the first generation of Jungian, the classical school, as Andrew put it, or as I call them, the orthodox Jungians. Out of this survey, 48 names were suggested. I contacted all the 48 suggested contributors via email. 30 agreed to take part in the project. One dismissed my invitation with contempt, saying to not wish to join a mass grave with those they had lifelong acrimony. All others did not come back to me. When contacting each of the contributors, I asked them to provide the following: a paper which you feel represents yourself, your work, and your intellectual or clinical trajectory, and a detailed and poetical biography written in first person, including as much information about you as you're willing to share. Therefore, I did not choose which paper to publish. They decided, as well as they decided how much personal information to share about themselves. And we know how little confident analysts are to share personal information. This book, of course, Verena is laughing. Of course, this book is full of biases. The first bias is that fundamental authors, at least as seminal as those included, are missing. This is because, for instance, I was not able to include those that were no longer alive by the time I knew I would be doing this book. Some living analysts who influence my generation, on the other hand, are no doubt unready to regard themselves as ancestors and decline my invitation. And I may not have realized I should have contacted others. Perhaps a third volume can be published in the future by a colleague who wants to take these upon from me. Apart from celebrating new ancestor within analytical psychology, this book wishes to bring a finalistic look at the future and ask, what is the task of my generation? Which is the Agenda 2050 for analytical psychology? I feel the answer lies in the following step. For a Jungian psychosocial relational model, Kulturkritik, social critics as much as personal therapists, the neo-Jungians, time for extraversion, medicine contra the soul. Let's dive into what I mean with Jungian psychosocial relational model. My own Jungian relational psychosocial model is based on the following pillars. It connects theory and clinical work. It is transdisciplinary. It is pluralistic. It starts from the premise that the individual is born into a set of social and psychological circumstances. It investigates the way in which psychic and social processes demand to be understood as always implicated in each other. It has an emphasis on affect, the irrational and unconscious process, often but not necessarily understood psychoanalytically. It offers a conflict relational approach and stresses the need for continuous adaptation in the process of becoming who people authentically are. Becoming who people authentically are is seen as a liberation. Analysis is framed as a campaigning based on the co-construction and multiplicity of meaning. Those who know the work of Mary, Andrew, Verena, and John for sure have recognized their bit in these 9 points. Culture critic, social critic, as much as personal therapist. Andrew suggested that within both the microcosm of an individual and the macrocosm of the global village, we are floated by psychological themes, and that politics embodies the psyche of people. Thus, he reminds us that the founders of psychoanalysis felt themselves to be social critics as much as personal therapists, and in this respect recalls Freud, Jung, Maslow, Roger, Peirce, the Frankfurt School, Reich, and Fromm. Thus, he stresses that today more therapists than ever want psychotherapy to realize the social and political potential that its founders perceived in it, but is aware of the large gap between wish and actuality. I argue that the Jungian relational psychosocial model might fill this gap. In contrast to Hillman, Samuels actively demonstrated how useful and effective perspective derived from psychotherapy might be in the formation of policy, new ways of thinking about the political process, and in the resolution of conflict. This is Samuel's most innovative aspect, to see psychoanalysts as well as individuals as activists with a fundamental role to play within society. I propose that we should work both within and outside of the consulting room as successful consultant for politician, organization, activist group, etc., and also to regain the quid we inherited, although did not enact, of the founders of psychoanalysis, social critics, and personal therapists becoming again a new culture critic. We might be able to continue to play a newer role in the development of 21st century societies. This is why I started my conversation with breakfast at Kuznach, followed by lockdown therapy, and now war as reset, because I truly believe we have something to say. Who are the new Jungians? The neo-Jungians are, I propose, the third generation of Jungians, being the first generation between 1961 and 1985, called the Zurich School, or the Orthodox Jungian, and the second generation between 1985 and 2011, called by Andrew the post-Jungians. The neo-Jungian employ Jung in a new fashion, along with other schools and traditions of psychoanalysis and beyond psychoanalysis, which mutually contaminate and enrich each other. The neo-Jungians, encompassing eclecticism and integration, aims to restore and enhance Jung's work, an analytical psychology at the core of depth psychology by studying the psyche as plural. This new approach is constituted by an heterogeneous, international, and multicultural group of scholars, just to name two, Tine Papic and Monica Lucci, who are with us tonight, while on the other hand have opened their investigation beyond analytical psychology. Therefore, the neo-Jungians are able to balance the teachings of Jung and the post-Jungians with those teachings coming from other schools and traditions, both within and beyond psychoanalysis, in a mutual and plural enriching exchange. In fact, contemporary neo-Jungians can be linked, although not limited, to relational and post-relational psychoanalysis, feminist psychoanalysis, the intersubjective approach, psychosocial studies, cultural study, just to name a few. And the neo-Jungians find in the aforementioned Jungian psychosocial relational model their frame of reference. The task of the neo-Jungians is to look at the future, of course, and the first thing to do is to honor and preserve the work the first and second generation of Jungian put forward. Extroversion is not superficial. Jungians mainly stress introversion in their clinical writings, and this has not always been helpful outside our circle. I hope that in the next 30 years, to be a little bit banal or naive, some of us, the most extroverted one perhaps, like me, will be able to influence society as culture critic outside of our usual circles, presenting our work at non-Jungian and non-psychoanalytic conferences, talking about our approach with pride and courage and without inferiority at different media outlets. Verena does it, Andrew does it, John does it, policymakers and institutions of different sort. Medicine and the soul, and then I conclude. Mine, like Hillman's, is a campaign in favor of analysis as modern medicine imposes a split between doctor and his soul, and as it is fundamental that the practice of psychotherapy must leave the medical background behind to proceed independently. Oops. If you didn't realize, I am reading, and my paper went away. Just give me one second. This is the nice thing when you are live. Here we are. Hillman underlines that Freud soon realized that it was necessary to partially abandon medicine because the analyst does not physically examine his patient. does not prescribe in medicine, or her, for organic disorders. He, she refers it to others. In the analyst office, there are no medical devices. You don't see white coats and black briefcases. So I propose that the degree in medicine or psychology are not the prerogative to access psychoanalytic training, but that the criteria enforced at the Carl Gustav Jung Institute in Zurich should be adopted. To write a 10 pages autobiography, then to go through 6 interviews with accredited analysts and going through 300 hours of training analysis parallel during the second half of the training by individual and group supervision. And of course, as in antidomia, an internship in a psychiatric institution, not as a patient though. Last, following Andrew Samuel's proposal at the 4th Analysis and Activism Conference in San Francisco 2020, I agree that training to be truly egalitarian should not require a master's degree, not even a bachelor degree. Candidates should be interviewed and accepted on the basis of the fulfillment of the above-mentioned requirements and their willingness to train, learning the theoretical aspect of this profession, and to undergo self-analysis to become a Jungian psychoanalyst. Thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you to the new ancestors that are here with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for that wonderful introduction and for framing our event tonight, this book launch to honor our new ancestors. Now, next, I would like to invite Mary Watkins to say a few words about her contribution. Mary, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Kevin. And first of all, congratulations, Stefano. I can't imagine all the labors that went into editing 2 such complicated volumes. Thank you. So in 12 minutes, I just want to suggest two stories. Today, I find myself in Montgomery, Alabama, at the end of a 6-week journey from Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and the Mississippi Delta, researching my own family's involvement in enslaving other human beings, and in the Mississippi Delta, destroying ancient hardwood forest, clearing the land for cotton fields. And, you know, I'm 71 now. It took me a long time to get around to really nailing down the specificities of the hundreds and perhaps thousands of people that my extended family enslaved, and what that meant. I've been studying for a long time, you know, people's understandings of what it meant for those enslaved, but I'm trying to grapple with what it means for white people of privilege and some wealth to metabolize our history. And I think back to my various analyses and therapies in my 20s, and don't believe that any of the questions posed to me ever began to peel back the history of my ancestors. And I decided to begin with ancestors because of the theme of this book. And so when we think about where therapy needs to go, in part, it's to begin to ask, and I know many are already, a very different set of questions in addition to the ones that we do routinely ask. Questions that would delve back a number of generations and into the political histories, the advocacies, the greed, the ideologies that families pass along, be they racist ideologies, ideologies of individualism, etc. But how are we as analysts and therapists to learn how to ask such questions unless we are more immersed in our own community and in other communities? And that will bring me to my second story, that about 26 years ago, we started an experiment at Pacifica, first in the depth psychology program and now in the community liberation, indigenous, and eco-psychology's PhD program, that instead of beginning with training people to do therapy, yes, there would be the theoretical underpinnings of depth psychology and Jungian psychology, but that the practice part would be discerning something that really matters to you within the community setting and apprenticing yourself to people who are deeply involved in that, not to become a missionary of Jungian psychology or depth psychologies, but really to begin to learn from what we could call cultural workers who are on the scene, who have a lot of psychosocial understanding from their very direct struggle with structural issues of inequities, injustice, and human difficulty. So students would become engaged in a wide variety of issues, often based on a thread into their own autobiography that connects them to the wider world. And from that, begin to discern a way of interacting in a participatory, dialogical, hopefully horizontal way with other people, so that they could be of whatever help they could be, but also deepen their understanding that there is this firm line between the private and the public, the psyche and the social, the intrapsychic and the interpsychic. When we were about 10 years into this experiment, I found Ellen Danto's book, Freud's Free Clinics. And it was really very, very heartening for me, because some of my colleagues felt, well, this is what you're doing. It doesn't have anything to do with depth psychology. But there in the free clinics in Berlin and Vienna, of course, many analysts, psychoanalysts, were forming kindergartens. They were counseling women who were victims of domestic violence. They were working with architects to develop public housing that would engender, the plan of which would engender a sense of community. They were helping people organize unions and do adult education on psychosocial issues. But gradually, as you know, when analysts were forced to come to the US, they had to hide that work because of McCarthyism in this country. And we lost this very rich model of therapists really moving in a very fluid way between what I'd call the private practice of depth psychologies to the public practice and back again. When I think about the future, I'm hoping that we can nourish this practice of going back and forth between levels of organization, so that when we're working with individuals, we have a much deeper sense of the communities out of which they come, the struggles, the harms that may have been perpetuated, as in my own family. And that when we move into community-based settings, we bring our capacity for empathy, metaphorical understanding, deep listening, et cetera, that we've spent so many years trying to nourish. So that's really all I want to bring today to this work. I've been very nourished by looking at liberation psychologies from the South. When I first found the work of Paulo Freire from Brazil, I really felt it was the missing half of depth psychology, and that if you put together psychologies that really focus on listening into groups of people and what they're going through and how they're working together to change the oppressive features of their everyday life, if you put that together with the depth-oriented listening in depth psychology, you begin to have a much more complete and whole way of proceeding. So thank you for listening, and I wish you very well with your work, Stefano.
Thank you very much, Mary. I'm I'm sure I speak on behalf of all colleagues. I'm just so touched that you would share that personal work and that personal research you're doing into your family history. So thank you so much for sharing that, but also just giving us a glimmer and a snapshot of the work, your body of work that we appreciate so much. So thank you, Mary. Next, I would like to ask John to say a few words. John, go ahead, please, sir.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Stefano for the opportunity to be in this book with the essay that he placed in the book, which is one that I wrote when I was 41 years old and was published originally in 1981. And sure enough, 41 years later, I had a chance to do something that I had felt and held for 4 decades, because I was never entirely satisfied with the essay in the form that it was published. Even though it said most of what I want to say, it didn't say quite all. And here came a chance to say it again 41 years later, which I think is kind of interesting. So at the age of 82, I picked up something that finally that I'd been holding in my mind is I have to revise that just to bring it to the last level. Andrew had long since said, that's really your best paper. It's a seminal paper. It's called The Trickster in the Arts. I was never satisfied, and Stefano allowed me to put it in the second volume of his book. And best of all, he recognized it as a clinical paper, because it always was a clinical paper, even though it's about art and the arts. And that was part of the tricksterism of the paper itself that was not recognized by most anybody. And the relation so the paper is about 2 things, and it was very important to me because this is the paper that records my own survival as a person, and it also was the way in which I was able to survive as a Jungian analyst. And it's about play, and it's about play in urgency when the artist is struggling to survive. So the paper is in many ways about survival, and it's about what can be learned from the artist in extremis about survival. And what I found is that in most of the great artists' lives, there is a kind of work, and it just happens to be a kind of work that I've always been drawn to, even since I was a college student and before, in which the artist finds himself in the very act of making art in a kind of double bind. Now, remember what a double bind is. If you don't know the double bind theory, I grew up on it. I chose to train at Stanford University's Medical Center, Department of Psychiatry, because Don Jackson and others who had formulated the concept of the double bind were there, and I thought it had the most interesting advances. It's that, well, I'll say a dream of a patient in analysis. He dreamed he was driving on the wrong, he was driving down a one-way street and suddenly realized that he was driving the wrong way on that one-way street. So being very concerned that he'd done that, he quickly turned off, only to find himself driving the wrong way in another one-way street. And he was in the car and he couldn't leave it. So there is the double bind. You can't do this and you can't do that, and you can't leave the field. So it's really thrice greatest Hermes in action. It's because there's always a 3 to the double bind. So Mercurius is duplex, and yet he's thrice greatest in the sense that it requires of us something that Ethan Allen Hitchcock, who was the first to study alchemy from a psychological point of view, he was a Swedenborgian, he knew Henry and William James' father well in the 19th century, he called hermetic integrity. So the artist has to practice a kind of hermetic integrity when they're in a double bind, and they're usually in a state of rage and despair at the time they create the kind of work I'm talking about. So to get you into the paper and what I was trying to get at and learn from myself and try to help my patients learn from, as far as surviving through the creative play of Jungian analysis. And I happen to think that Jungian analysis or clinical analytical psychology, as Jung practiced it, is the most sublime form of play ever created in civilization. I think it's an amazing art and an amazing thing. And when it works, it really allows people to survive in a way that I haven't seen anything else do. And I've spent most of my life looking for things that can heal people. So let's take an artist with a problem. And I'm going to take something from my paper. In 1913, Gertrude Stein published a poem called Sacred Emily. And it's all about her daily life, and it's all about her daily life with a woman partner. And she's in the midst of it. She writes her most famous line, which is all about making love to a woman. And I think with Sacred Emily must have some kind of homage to Emily Dickinson, who must have had some of the same issues. The woman poet writing about what it is to love a woman has many different problems. And in the 20th century, Gertrude Stein had to face them all. First is that supposedly all the love poems about women are by men, and they're usually about courtship, and they're usually by men about women they hardly know. So the question is, what could a woman possibly add who has been living with and loving a woman a great long time? It's a different kind of love poem, and how can she make it fresh? Secondly, the men have exhausted all the metaphors for lovemaking. And third, not to declare the love, she can't leave the field. She can't leave this undone. Gertrude Stein didn't intend to leave it undone. And so she wrote her most famous poem, which is just the most exquisite description of what it must be like for a woman to love a woman and to love a woman and to feel the womanness of her love for the woman she loves. Rose is a rose is a rose. Well, she had her chance. That was in 1913, and she's in Paris, and she could say what she liked. Very different when the autobiography of that woman she loved, Alice B. Toklas, is published, and it's really by Gertrude Stein, written as if the autobiography of her partner. And she is a bestseller in America, and she has to come to America in 1933 and explain herself with Alice with her on her tour of the United States as to what her poem was about. So this is the trickster in the arts talking. A student in one of her seminars asked for the meaning of rose is a rose is a rose. And this was her reply. Gertrude said, "Now listen, can't you see that when the language was new as it was with Chaucer and Homer, the poet could use the name of the thing and the thing was really there? He could say, oh moon, oh sea, oh love, and the moon and the sea and love were really there. And can't you see that after hundreds of years had gone by and thousands of poems had been written, he could call on those words and find they were just worn out literary words. The excitingness of pure being had withdrawn from them. They were just rather stale literary words. Now the poet has to work in the excitingness of pure being. He has to get back that intensity into the language. I'm amused that she had to use sexist language in her time. We all know that it's hard to write poetry in a late age. That spoke to me because it's also hard to practice analysis in a late age. And we know that you have to put some strangeness as something unexpected into the structure of the sentence in order to bring vitality to the noun. Now, it's not enough to be bizarre. The strangeness in the sentence structure has to come from the poetic gift too. That's why it's doubly hard to be a poet in a late age. A beautiful statement of the double bind. Doubly hard and in a late age. Now, you all have seen hundreds of poems about roses, and you know in your bones that the rose is not there. All those songs that sopranos sing as encores about, I have a garden. Oh, what a garden. Now, I don't want to put too much emphasis on that line because it's just one line in a longer poem. But I noticed that you all know it. You make fun of it, but you know it. Now listen, I'm no fool. I know that in daily life, we don't go around saying is a. Yes, I'm no fool. But I think that in that line, the rose is read for the first time in English poetry for 100 years. Well, that is a big piece of what my paper is about. It's about the necessity of breaking through the double bind of repeating the same old formulas. And the importance for certain artists of facing the fact that what they've done is already old. And if it's already old, it's no longer creative. And so what has been done is already old. What they have done is already old because at first they were doing what others had done. So I show a lot of works of art, and I'll quickly show one that by sharing my screen that I chose for this, not realizing that Mr. Foucault had been there long before I, but nevertheless, I want to share it with you because I think and say what I had to say about it. And then you may get a sense of what I mean by the need to kind of allow something to infuse the spirit of the trickster if it's going to be able to reverse the terms of the double bind as skillfully as Gertrude Stein did with the three words, rose is a rose is a rose. Somehow she pushes back on all the terms of the double bind. So too does this painting by René Magritte. I'm going to share the screen so that you can see it on my desktop. So the French says, are you hearing me? The French says, this is not a pipe. Now, this is one of the most famous works of art. There are different versions of it. This particular version is one that I think Jungian analysts should study because it has the title La Trahison des Images, which means the treachery of images. And that trahison is a bit like the word treason in English, the treachery of images. So in this piece, the larger than life-size flat commercial image of a curved briar pipe floats above an inscription in French, which reads, "This is not a pipe." And of this work painted in 1928 and 9, Magritte told a 1966 interviewer, "The famous pipe, how people reproached me for it. And yet, could you stuff my pipe? No. It's just a representation, is it not? So if I had written on my picture, this is a pipe, I would have been lying." Now, sometimes you have to lie to tell the truth. So I wanted to talk in my paper about something that I've had to learn to do. So many people in my time talked about boundaries. And it was Andrew who, when I was working on integrity and depth, said, "Thank heaven you don't get so heavily into boundary integrity because it becomes moralistic in a flash." And this paper does talk about boundary, but it talks about living on the boundary. It cautions about crossing the boundary, living between the boundary. That's the area. And you know, I grew up in homes where we didn't only have canned food, but we also had food that was sealed in glass. And for instance, applesauce, and it was sold in glass, and it was called hermetically sealed. And I think it's kind of interesting that Hermes, the great god of boundary crossings, was also, and a bit vulgar, you know, at the edges of the city-states, there would be the image of Hermes with an erect penis, as if to say, you come in here and we'll fuck you, and business. So that was the way the Greek city-states looked at each other. Very vulgar, as the trickster always is. But the idea of you cross the boundary if you know that the shadow is present, it has a chance that the transaction will have some authentic integrity rather than just the illusion and the protection and the persona of it. So we call this, thanks to Victor Turner, liminality. It's a limin, this limit between. And so it's liminality that makes, says my paper, Magritte, this is not a pipe, so outrageous. At first, we find ourselves agreeing, of course it's not a pipe, it's a picture of a pipe. And this admission locks us into the field of the picture. We are drawn into a dialogue with the artist about art in which further reflections follow. If we like the interior life of the painted things in art, we are likely to reflect, of course it isn't a pipe and it isn't well enough painted to be anything. Yet if we approach that work naturalistically, we have to concede, well, of course it could be a pipe. It looks just like a pipe. It could serve as a sign over a tobacconist's shop and induce someone to long for a smoke. And whichever way we think, we are drawn into talking from this liminal space between art and life. And the conjunction we usually experience between them when we simply suspend disbelief and simply enjoy the work of art is broken down because we have been forced into that conceptual no land that exists between things and their representations. Everything we say back to the painting only reinforces our liminal entrapment. And this makes the work itself a formidable trickster. Well, I can only say that this work on this paper that did actually tend to cost 241 sectors of my life is been absolutely helpful to me as a clinician practicing Jungian analysis every day. I still have a busy practice, and I'm as motivated to do this as the day when on my 19th birthday, when I first announced that I wanted to be a psychiatrist, because it's an infinitely great pleasure to live in that liminal space. And I hope this paper will help other clinicians take heart. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. What a wonderful reflection, and such an amazing synchronicity as well. You know, all these elements coming together. Certainly, the opportunity to revise the paper was very meaningful, and the fruits of your labor, as you've just described them, absolutely fantastic. I've written several notes already. Liminal entrapment. What a lovely idea. So, John, you never cease to amaze me with what you produce and the ideas you put out there. So thank you very much, John. Next, I would like to invite Verena Kast to say a few words about her contribution. Go ahead, please, Verena.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Stefano, heartfelt congratulations to these two anthologies. I know there is a lot of work behind, and I estimate very much you have ideas, you have a lot of ideas, and you are able to realize them. And I really appreciate that. And I think these are two very important volumes. I find particularly interesting and appealing that you got the authors to write a narrative, poetic biography. How you have been able to convince Routledge of this idea, I don't know. And for me, it seems to be a miracle. And when we meet in private, I would really like to know how you manage this. For me, this is a very, very important contribution to the anthology. And it is very special. I have never seen it in this way. Okay, we can read the paper, some paper we know, but then we get the background, we get a personal background to it. And I must confess, I have not yet read the scientific texts but I have read these narrative biographies with pleasure and with great interest. So what I'm talking about, I don't want to talk about the Agenda 2050. This agenda I leave for the younger ancestors. But I would like to reflect briefly with you on what we need in the near future as a society and where we can be contributing from Jungian psychology. I'm talking about losses. We have and we will have increasingly experiences of loss in the outer world, in the inner world, due to the ecological crisis, due to the Ukrainian war, due to Corona perhaps even. And the question is, how do we deal with losses? When we lose something that was valuable to us, we mourn. If we refuse to grieve or do not even target it, then we become angry, jaded, or depressed. So the question in dealing with these losses will be, are we accepting the losses? Are we feel the losses? How do we deal with grief? How are we doing loss? Part of grieving is remembering. No one can take away the memory of the past, not even fate. Fate has no access to the past. That's what we are left with. We know from mourning processes that if we succeed in perceiving experiences of the past in an imaginative way, then they are connected with emotions. We can re-experience the past and become emotionally alive in the process. But even if joyful or pleasant everyday memories are brought to life in the imagination, the loss cannot be explained away. In mourning, however, joy and melancholy arise, both in the same time, both important. Joy about what one has had, melancholy that one no longer has it. Combined, and this is the important point about imaginations, with imaginations of what might be important of the past and desired for the future. For doing loss, we need our imagination. We need a broad variety of imaginations. In connection with the ecological crisis, there is a new way of looking at the interplay of nature, man, and economy under the term enlivenment. It is represented above all by Andreas Weber, a German biologist, philosopher, and publicist. And what does he mean by enlivenment? Everything that exists, things, people, nature, should not only be seen from the point of view of abstract structures and functions, say money, success, costs, benefit, but from the perspective of liveliness. Does something contribute to liveliness? And here again, the ability of creative imagination plays a big role. Even if we lose a lot, we can still ask ourselves, what makes us alive? Andreas Weber starts from the idea that our aliveness, our emotional impulses, and our poetic imagination acts as a self-organizing system into the different ecosystems. You can compare this with the quote of C.G. Jung when it says, to fantasize as an imagination is an imaginative activity is identical with the sequence of the psychic energetic processes. Imagination for Weber is a real force that instigates productive change. Productive in the in the imagination of new forms of life, even in envisioning the ecological crisis, but then also in the embodied experience of new forms. All this connected with other people, all this in living relationship. What is important about this thinking is when we are in imaginative interaction with external reality, the world becomes a you. It is not simply an it. And thus, the relationship to the world changes. We are more connected, we are more caring. Imagination belongs for Weber, and he's not a Jungian, to the first person perspective that is next to the third person perspective. He feels that the science uses only the third person perspective, but we have to have a room for the first person perspective. That means we, with our body, with our feelings, with our desires, with our imaginations. And for this, we also need a world, not only the world for the third perspective. And because when we are only explaining the world from a third perspective, it is our feelings and our imagination is not included. In the face of possible failure, of loss, of the experience of finiteness, creativity is experienced as centrally important, but not with the utopian goal of solving all problems. According to Weber and others, these imaginations have to prove themselves in the world of the chaotic. There remains the expectation and conviction that there will always be an imagination of something new out of the constraints of the factual. So there will always be possibilities, and these possibilities will never be completely redeemable in faculty. And this is to be endured. So this is a modern idea to deal with the ecological loss and to gaze a new standpoint, and to gaze a standpoint where you can feel alive. So in many contexts nowadays, imagination, creative imagination, is placed at the center of interest. And I think we Jungians, we have to contribute here something. The question of the imagination is, in which world do we want to live? And then the next question is, and what are we doing to construct the life in which we want to be? But also what makes us feel alive? So what can we contribute? I think we have to highlight the importance of imagination and the importance of first person perspective next to the third person perspective. This is important because books like the one of Weber about enlivening are seen as a romantic view of the world. It might be a romantic view of the world, but perhaps the romantic view of the world brings us better ideas than the only scientific view of the world. Then more practical, we have to help people to get more easy access to the imagination. And I don't mean patience, to trust, and to help them also to deal with problems. And perhaps most important, to encourage people sharing imaginations to a specific topic in the hope that by sharing there will be emerging new ideas. So perhaps this could become a way of life. Some people of us, we are doing sports together. Why not doing imaginations together to a specific topic? Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Verena. As always, very wise words. Definitely stirring some thoughts about looking ahead in the very near future and the society, as you say, that we want to construct, the reality that we want to live in. So thank you so much for that. Next, I would like to ask Andrew to say a few words about his contribution. Andrew, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Am I on screen? I can see John. I can only see John. But
yes,
that's okay because
you are on screen. You will be in the video.
Okay. I would like to show you, and I hope John will see it, what I've been drinking out of this evening.
Oh, si. N'est pas.
So it's also a coffee mug.
Yes.
But I want to extemporize about the significance of this before I start on my remarks. You see, this was sold in a gallery. It's about the monetization of this work. And the monetization of therapy, which is the big subject, and Jungian analysis, the small subject, is something that we really need to be talking about going forward. So I think that this appropriation of an artwork that is already extremely paradoxical is relevant to our profession, its shadow, its strength, its corruption. I've divided my remarks into three. I'm going to talk about Stefano. I'm going to talk about the idea of the book. And I'm going to talk about the future under the heading, the political turn, the political turn. So first of all, Stefano, you are a genius. To get 30 out of 48 Jungian analysts to participate is fucking amazing. I think you maybe think that that was not a success. I can tell you, having spent my whole adult life in this field, that is an extraordinary achievement. To put collectivity and extroversion on the agenda in the way that you have is remarkable. You have also drawn our attention in recent months to what is meant by political activism when conducted by analysts and therapists. You've set up projects in Italy in which therapists and analysts work with people who were on the front line in the early stages of the COVID pandemic. And very recently, you have been involved in setting up a therapy project for people in Ukraine. You constantly are telling us, do it. Don't just think, don't just theorize, do it. And I'll return to that point later. Second, about this book. First of all, the idea to get people to submit their favorite papers from their vast production is itself both an extraordinary piece of chutzpah, the Yiddish word for cheek of the devil, and also a brilliant piece of academic legerdemain, because it was wonderful to see, as I have done, what each of the community of writers chose. And of course, not only did I recognize John's paper, Verena, I recognized your paper and Denise's paper and several other papers that I can't remember at the moment. This stressed the community of these new ancestors. It stressed the fact that we've grown up together. It doesn't mean we like each other 100%, but we like each other enough That's why I'm very much hoping people will go to the IAAP in Buenos Aires, not to support the IAAP, but to meet one another, because, and this is the next point I want to say about this book, soon many of these authors will be dead. Death is the leitmotif of this book. Hillman, Fordham, Adler, Mario Jacobi, Fred Ploud, Guggenbull Craig, and so on, they are dead. And in their day, they had to accept that von Franz, Yolanda Jacobi, James Kirsch, Erich Neumann, Freddie Meyer, they were dead. Every single one of Stefano's authors is over 70, and a significant number are over 80. This is really important, and this is what this notion of the new ancestors is really all about. We read Jung, we read Hillman, Fordham, Adler, etc. We read von Franz, Jacobi, James Kirsch, Neumann, and so on. We want the new generations to read us. So there is a narcissistic greed in this phalanx of authors that Stefano has breathed into existence. We want to be ancestors. It's not just a question of some nice young guy nominating us as ancestors. He has identified the generativity, the fantasy of generativity in the over 70s. And I think this is what the book is about, and why it will be of such extraordinary use in training, because these are the people who are training now need to read. Sorry to bring in death, but it fits in with Verena's talk about loss. In 10 years' time, how many of these 30 authors will be alive? Third, this is about the future, and I called it the political turn. My paper is called The Activist Client, and I mean this literally, working clinically with people who are activists, people who are burned out activists, people who are too damn frightened to be activists. And I also meant it metaphorically, how the client, not the patient, by the way, how the client can be the active motor of the whole therapeutic process. This is something that I feel is more than relationality. I mean, my second professional identification is as a relational psychoanalyst, in addition to being a Jungian analyst. I served for 15 years as a founder board member of the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy. I believe in that shit. I think it's really good. But beyond the relational turn, there is the political turn. And our political turn has been quite a long time coming. Whether it's Odeinik or Jerome Bernstein, or earlier, the guy whose name escapes me, who wrote the book about the sociological significance of Jungian psychology. Someone, Kevin, will know the name, and I can't remember. It's been cooking for a long time. And of course, Jung was interested in the political world as well. So I want to say something about the relational turn in its political version, in its political variant. And I've picked out a number of features. I think the difficulty with talking about the future is that you always end up talking about the present. It's going on now. You think you're far seeing. You think you are looking ahead. Ira Progoff, Jung's Psychology and its Social Meaning. Thank you. Some demon gave me the material. You think you're thinking about the future, but you're really talking about the present. So here are the features that I think are interesting. Clinical work cannot now be other than psychosocial. We know that even the traditional raw material of depth psychology, dreams, active imaginations, fantasy, and the like, is irradiated with the political and social history of the individual concerned. You can't work anymore without that understanding. It's really important. Mary Watkins was talking about that. I think Jungians have pretty much got the tools to do this, but they often hold back because it's somehow not kosher. It's not the right thing to do. But we have a way of seeing through, beyond, beneath, and above the personal. Usually we use that capacity to see beyond the personal as a spiritual matter or an interest in spiritual development. But what if we switch and see that beyond the personal lies the political? And that if you want to be in that tradition of Jungian analysis in which the personal is not only personal, then these days you have to embrace the political turn. By the way, this is not easy because the material that would help people to do it doesn't exist. There are not many books and papers about how you work with political stuff in therapy. Specifically, there isn't any really about how you work with political stuff that you don't agree with. How do you work with a banker? How do you work with a redneck? How do you work with a right winger or left winger if you happen to be of the right? This is not easy, and we are not helping ourselves by endeavoring to go into the detail of that quest. The second feature of the political turn is that therapy thinking is very useful in politics. I know this myself from having done a lot of political consultancy, but certain ideas are very useful. For me, the notion of good enoughness, which I took from Donald Winnicott, is a really important approach to leadership. Others, I'm not one, others use complex theory. Others are interested in the transcendent function, although I don't agree with a lot of that work because it seems to involve sitting outside a conflict and sort of evaluating, judging, and healing it. Nevertheless, clinical ideas have political utility, and we should not be frightened about claiming that. So I've said clinical work must be psychosocial. I've said that therapy thinking has a role to play in politics, and I'll return to that towards the end. But thirdly, and this is perhaps with a sophisticated group like those of us assembled here this evening, it's the most important. The political turn involves being critical and skeptical about the political turn. I am not interested in rah, 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 let's do politics in our psychology. We have to think this through. I am an enthusiast, but I'm also extremely skeptical about the relationship between depth psychology and political action and political thinking. Let me give a little more flesh to these critiques. Firstly, too many of us, including me, sorry to say, are more interested in being right than in making a difference. We love our theories. They are narcissistic extensions of ourselves. And yes, I'm perhaps generalizing from my pathology, but looking around the people on this Zoom call and thinking of people I know in other schools of psychotherapy, this desire and insistence to be right kills the attempt to bring psychology into the polis, into the political sphere. Another thing that's very important is that we therapists should not do this on our own. We need to make alliances with people in the social justice field, understood very broadly, with people working in relation to economic injustice. This is my big interest at the moment, is the depth psychology of economic inequality. And we need to be looking to work with people currently involved in women's rights and the pushback against the Supreme Court in the United States in relation to abortion, which will affect Britain for sure, and probably many European countries as well. But we need to find them and work with them in a modest way, accepting that sometimes they won't want us. I've seen this in relation to Extinction Rebellion, where many therapists want to be involved, but the Extinction Rebellion leadership, whilst welcoming it, are also a little bit skeptical. Do we really need the shrinks? Do we really need them? So it's not so simple to find people to play with, but it can be done. And I think it has to be done. The next thing I want to say, as part of this critique of my work, which is what this is really all about, and I think you need to do this when you feel you're entering the last phase of your life. I mean, there's no factual reason, by the way, in case I have patients or supervisees here. I'm not dying as far as I know, but I'm entering the last phase of my career, let's put it that way. I think that we really have to question who benefits from all this political stuff that we're all so terribly excited about. I don't want to, I'm not having a conversion here. I think it's valuable. I think it's good. But we also need to ask who is benefiting. Are suffering people benefiting, or are the therapists who are involved in the political doing anything more than just having a masturbation? That's really important. Now, I come to the last part of this. It's part of the political turn. It's part of the skepticism that I'm trying to present in parallel with my, I hope, apparent enthusiasm. This has to do with Jungian history. Specifically, it has to do with the twin issues of anti-Semitism and race. On Friday night, in a webinar to Brazil, I'm going to have to talk again about Jung and anti-Semitism. I really wish I hadn't, but some famous Lacanian analyst has lifted Elizabeth Roudinesco's book and has basically said Jung is a Nazi, blah, blah, blah. And they asked me to speak about it. And I said, listen, you're asking the wrong person if you want this thing cleaned up. But I think they got the point, and they're happy, I hope, to hear what I have to say, because there is a problem. And with regard to race, no longer is it possible for those of us involved in this political turn to say, oh, he's just a man of his times. There were options open to Jung. And even if we forget about Jung altogether, those of us in the age group that this book platforms need to accept that it's partly our responsibility to respond to our critics out there in relation to these issues, anti-Semitism, and I think the best way to put it is racial hierarchicalism or something like that. It's not the note on which maybe I was expected to end, but there it is. Once again, Stefano, you are, as I say, a genius. You are an impresario. You are the Diaghilev of our field. and we owe you a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for, again, this, as always, very clear, very to the point delivery of these big headline points about, from which everyone still continues to learn and get so much from. So thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you, Stefano. I think all our colleagues and contributors here have given attendees tonight such a flavor of what is in these two volumes. So hopefully colleagues will go out, purchase the two volumes. As we indicated, we have the discount code that we've put in earlier. Now, I'm very mindful of time and that we are kind of approaching the end and going over and above. However, we have so many other senior colleagues here who have contributed to this volume. And I just wanted to create a space for other contributors to perhaps say a few words before we leave tonight. And at this particular moment, I would like to invite Astrid Berg to say a few words. Astrid, are you there?
Yeah.
Hello, Astrid. Are you able to unmute, or can Paul unmute you?
Right. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good evening. Well, I have not prepared anything, but would just like to, as Verena said, and everybody, to congratulate Stefano for having pulled this together. When he first wrote to me, I was very surprised that I was part of this list, and I still don't quite understand how I got there. But then I did what he so simply asked us to do, and it was a very interesting exercise process for me. And I chose a paper which is not a very Jungian paper. It's a very down-to-earth paper about my work in the community of Khayelitsha in a township near Cape Town for, well, nearly 2 decades. And I wonder why I chose that paper and not a more sort of cultural Jungian one on ancestor reverence, what I've also written. But I chose this one maybe because I wanted to show concrete work done in the community. I didn't want to theorize, although there is theory in the paper, but it's about very real work that I did. And I live in a country where there are ongoing struggles with the pain of the past and how it continues to affect us in the present. So I connected very much with what Mary Watkins was saying with her 2 stories. And I want to make a plea for us, for psychoanalysis, for Jungians, to focus as much or maybe even more on the horizontal relationships between us as human beings, on a more truly reflective practice with each other, as much as we focus on the ego-self vertical axis. Because I feel, especially in these horrific times, frightening times, where everything is so upside down, unless we can also really connect with each other, I'm not sure where we're going to go in this world. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and do read my paper in that light. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Astrid. Lovely reflections. I think, everyone, we need to bring our session to a close, but just to acknowledge before we sign off, in addition to the lovely synopses, if you will, and reflections by Mary, John, Verena, Andrew, and now Astrid, we have other wonderful contributions and contributors here tonight. Denise Ramos, Warren Coleman, Lionel Corbett. So just wanted to acknowledge your presence here and your big contribution to these 2 books as well. So everyone, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank our contributors. I want to thank Stefano, Paul, Bernard, all the organizers behind the scenes at Psychosocial Wednesday. And just to let you know, there is another session next week with our good colleague, Robin McCoy Brooks, and that will be excellent as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a great night, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Verena. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone else. Bye-bye.